Professor Kelvin of the Zentari Academic Collective stood before his podium like a peacock who had just discovered mirrors. His lavender skin practically glowed under the lecture hall lights, and his three eyes blinked in sequence whenever he wanted to emphasize a point, which was often, very often. "And now, esteemed students," he announced, manipulating the holographic display with a flourish that would make a magician jealous, "we arrive at the most disturbing evidence of humanity's barbaric past." The auditorium, packed with 200 alien students from 40 different species, leaned forward in their seats. Well, those who had seats. The Vlorgians just kind of hovered near the ceiling, their gelatinous forms quivering with anticipation. Professor Kelvin tapped his datapad, and the holographic display shifted to show a collection of metallic instruments arranged on a velvet cloth. They gleamed under the simulated lighting, each one looking more threatening than the last. "Behold," Kelvin said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a dramatic whisper, but was really just loud whispering. "The murder tools of primitive Earth." A collective gasp rippled through the auditorium. One student, a Thraxian with approximately 17 tentacles, fainted and had to be carried out by their study partner. "Note the precision of the blades," Kelvin continued, zooming in on a scalpel. "The calculated cruelty of the serrated edges." He highlighted a surgical saw, and this particularly heinous device, he pointed to a retractor, clearly designed to inflict maximum suffering. In the back row, Jake Murphy was trying to enjoy his sandwich in peace. The human exchange student had signed up for Xenoanthropology 301 because it fit his schedule, and because the course description promised minimal participation requirements. As a medical school dropout who had bidded, switched to xenobiology after realizing he couldn't handle the sight of Zentari blood, which was apparently purple and smelled like grape soda, Jake just wanted easy credits. He took another bite of his turkey club and glanced up at the holographic display. Then he stopped chewing. Then he looked again, squinting at the screen. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," he muttered through a mouthful of sandwich. "The primitive humans," Professor Kelvin was saying, warming to his subject like a campfire warming to gasoline, "used these instruments in ritualistic violence, territorial disputes, and what our research suggests were elaborate honor duels. The prevalence of these tools in their historical record indicates a society absolutely obsessed with, those are surgical instruments." The words came out louder than Jake had intended, probably because he had forgotten to swallow first. The entire auditorium turned to look at him. 200 alien faces, 300 alien eyes, and one very annoyed professor, all focused on the human in the back row holding half a sandwich. "Professor," Kelvin's three eyes blinked in rapid succession, a Zentari expression that roughly translated to, "Excuse me, did a piece of furniture just speak?" "I beg your pardon?" Kelvin said, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for students who asked if the final was cumulative. Jake swallowed his sandwich bite. He had not planned on participating today, or any day. But apparently, the universe had other plans. "Those are surgical instruments," he repeated, setting down his sandwich with the care of someone who knew he was about to ruin his entire afternoon. "From a hospital. We use them to save lives, not end them." The professor's lavender skin somehow managed to darken several shades, which Jake was pretty sure meant he was about to have a very bad day. Professor Kelvin's three eyes narrowed into what Jake was beginning to recognize as the Zentari equivalent of, "I'm about to end this man's whole career." The professor's fingers drummed against his podium, creating a rhythmic tapping that echoed through the now silent auditorium. "Mr. Murphy," Kelvin said, pronouncing Jake's name like it was a communicable disease. "While I appreciate your enthusiasm, I have been studying human artifacts for 20 standard years. I have published 17 peer-reviewed papers on human violence. I have a doctorate in xenoanthropology from the Galactic Institute of Cultural Studies. So unless you have credentials that somehow supersede 2 decades of rigorous academic research, I suggest you allow the actual expert to continue his lecture." Jake should have backed down. A smart person would have backed down. Jake's roommate, a very sensible Korthan named Bleep, who communicated entirely through bioluminescent patterns, had literally flashed, "Do not antagonize professors" at him just that morning. But Jake had spent 2 years in medical school before dropping out. 2 years of being told these exact instruments were the pinnacle of human medical achievement. 2 years of learning that the scalpel wasn't a weapon, it was hope. And watching this pompous alien call them murder tools was like watching someone call a fire extinguisher an arson device. "Okay," Jake said, standing up and immediately regretting his life choices. Explain the scalpel then. Professor Kelvin blinked. I just did. It's a cutting implement used in ritual. Ritual what? Be specific. What ritual? Combat preparation, Kelvin said, though his voice had lost a fraction of its confidence. Humans would sharpen their combat reflexes by… With a blade that small? Jake interrupted, gesturing at the hologram. That scalpel is maybe 4 inches long. You're telling the class that humans, who invented guns, missiles, and something called a nuclear bomb, decided the best way to prepare for combat was with a tiny knife that requires you to be close enough to smell your opponent's breakfast. A Vlorgen near the ceiling made a gurgling sound that might have been a laugh. Professor Kelvin shot at a glare that could have curdled milk across 3 star systems. The size is irrelevant, Kelvin snapped. It's the principle of… And the bone saw? Jake was committed now. His sandwich was abandoned. His GPA was probably about to join it. Tell everyone what that's for. Professor Kelvin manipulated the hologram to zoom in on the surgical saw, its serrated edge gleaming. Obviously for dismembering defeated enemies. The serrated edge ensures maximum damage to cut through bone during amputations and orthopedic surgery, Jake said flatly. You know, like when someone's leg gets crushed in an accident and you need to remove it so they don't die from infection or blood loss. Super villainous stuff. Surgery, Kelvin said, pronouncing the word like it was new to him. You mean humans deliberately cut into each other? To fix things, yeah. That's kind of the whole point of medicine. A Thraxian student raised several tentacles. But why not use a regeneration pod? Or cellular reconstruction? Because we didn't have those, Jake said. Humans had to actually figure out how bodies work and fix them manually. Revolutionary concept. I know. Professor Kelvin had recovered some of his composure. He pulled up another image, this one showing a cauterizing tool. And I suppose you have a peaceful explanation for this as well? This device, which clearly burns flesh, stops bleeding during surgery, Jake said. When you cut someone open to remove a tumor or repair an organ, blood vessels get severed. You cauterize them so the patient doesn't bleed out on the table. It's called hemostasis. We learned it in week 3. Week 3 of what? A student near the front asked. Medical school, which I dropped out of. But apparently I still know more about human medicine than Professor 20 years of research over here. The auditorium was completely silent now. Professor Kelvin's skin had gone from lavender to something approaching purple, which Jake was pretty sure meant he was either very angry or very embarrassed. Possibly both. These are surgical instruments, Jake repeated, his voice echoing in the quiet space. Every single one of them was designed by humans who were trying to save other humans. Not kill them, save them. Using the only technology we had at the time, which was sharp objects and a lot of hope. A student in the 3rd row, a Korthan who looked remarkably like Jake's roommate, flashed a pattern that Jake's translator rendered as, "Please continue." This is the most entertainment I have had all semester. Professor Kelvin straightened his robes with as much dignity as he could muster. Very well, Mr. Murphy. If you're such an expert, perhaps you'd like to come down here and educate us all on these supposed medical tools. It was meant to be a challenge, a way to embarrass Jake in front of 200 students and reassert professional authority. Jake picked up his sandwich, took one more bite, and started walking toward the front of the auditorium. Sure, he said. This should be fun. Jake arrived at the front of the auditorium with the confidence of someone who had already committed social suicide and decided he might as well enjoy the fall. Professor Kelvin stepped aside with the rigid posture of a man whose entire afternoon had been hijacked by a sandwich-eating dropout. All right, Jake said, facing the sea of alien faces that were now regarding him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Pop quiz. Who here has ever been seriously injured? About half the tentacles, appendages, and limbs in the room went up. A Vlorgen near the ceiling changed color to indicate affirmation. Cool. And how were you treated? Regeneration pod, said a student in the front row. Cellular reconstruction beam, offered another. My species just grows new limbs, volunteered a Thraxian, waving several spares as proof. Fantastic, Jake said. So you've all got magic healing technology that's been around for what, thousands of years? Inherited from predecessor species who figured it out eons ago? Nods and affirmative gestures rippled through the crowd. Humans didn't have any of that. Jake continued. No regeneration pods. No cellular reconstruction. No conveniently growing back lost limbs. We had bodies that broke easily and healed slowly, and absolutely zero instruction manual. So we had to figure it out ourselves. With these, he gestured at the holographic display, and for the first time, The instruments didn't look quite so menacing. They looked almost sad, desperate even. "Let's start with the scalpel," Jake said, manipulating the hologram to zoom in. "Humans get something called appendicitis. It's when this tiny organ in your abdomen decides to betray you by getting infected and threatening to explode. If it bursts, you die, painfully. So what do you do when you don't have a magic healing pod?" The auditorium was silent. "You cut the person open," Jake said. "Right here." He gestured to his lower right abdomen. "You make an incision with a scalpel because you need precision. You can't just hack away. You've got other organs in there, blood vessels, nerves. You cut carefully through skin, then fat, then muscle, then the peritoneum, and then you find the angry little organ that's trying to kill your patient and you remove it. Then you sew them back up and hope they don't get an infection because, oh yeah, we also didn't have antibiotics for most of human history." A student in the middle row looked vaguely ill. Their translator rendered their question as, "You cut into living humans while they are conscious?" "Oh, hell no," Jake said. "Well, not usually. That's where anesthesia comes in. We invented drugs that make you unconscious so you don't feel the cutting. Although before that, we did surgery with the patient awake and just had to work really, really fast while they screamed." Fun times in the 1800s. Professor Kelvin had gone very 40, quiet. His three eyes were all fixed on Jake now, but the condescension had been replaced with something that looked disturbingly like horror. "The bone saw," Jake continued, moving to the next instrument, "is for amputations and orthopedic surgery. Say you're in an accident and your leg gets crushed beyond repair. Gangrene sets in. That's when your tissue starts dying and rotting. The infection spreads. Without a regeneration pod, you've got two choices: lose the leg or lose your life. So a surgeon uses this saw to cut through the bone, removes the dead limb, seals up the blood vessels, and saves your life. You live. You just do it with one leg instead of two." "That's barbaric," whispered a Thraxian. "That's survival," Jake corrected. "We're not barbaric. We're persistent. There's a difference." He pulled up an image of a retractor, the instrument Professor Kelvin had called, "designed to inflict maximum suffering." "This is a retractor," Jake said. "During surgery, you need to see what you're working on. The human body is inconveniently full of layers, so you use retractors to hold tissue, muscle, and skin out of the way. It looks medieval, I'll grant you that, but it lets surgeons perform the first successful open-heart surgery in 1893. A guy named Daniel Hale Williams repaired a stab wound to a man's heart. He cut open the chest, sewed up the pericardium, and the patient lived. No regeneration pod, no cellular reconstruction, just a scalpel, some sutures, and a doctor who refused to let his patient die. The auditorium was completely silent now. Even the Vlordians had stopped their gentle floating and were hanging motionless in the air. "We developed cesarean sections," Jake continued, his voice softer now, "to save mothers and babies when natural birth became impossible. We created brain surgery techniques to remove tumors and repair aneurysms. We invented heart transplants, where we take a healthy heart from someone who just died and put it in someone who's dying, and then that person lives. We did all of this by cutting each other open because we had to." He turned to face Professor Kelvin directly. "These aren't murder tools, Professor. They're love made manifest. Every single one of these instruments exists because some human somewhere looked at another human who was dying and said, 'Not today.' They're proof that humans will literally cut each other open and root around in each other's bodies if that's what it takes to save a life. You call that barbaric. I call that the most hopeful thing our species ever did." A student near the back started what might have been applause, but stopped when they realized no one else was joining in. The silence stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, Professor Kelvin cleared his throat. "I may have mischaracterized some of these artifacts." "You think?" Jake said. But before the professor could respond, a Corthan student near the front flashed a desperate pattern. "Wait, you said you use drugs to make humans unconscious. You poison them?" Jake closed his eyes. "Oh boy. Okay, so let me explain anesthesia and why the dose makes the poison." This was going to be a long afternoon. The Corthan's question had opened a door that Jake immediately realized should have remained closed, locked, and possibly buried under several feet of concrete. "Anesthesia isn't poison," Jake said, already knowing this explanation was doomed. "It's more like controlled poison. We give you just enough to make you unconscious, but not enough to kill you. Usually, squeaked a small Pixarian student whose translator made them sound like a terrified chipmunk. I mean, there are risks, Jake admitted. That's why we have anesthesiologists. Their whole job is to keep you in that sweet spot between awake and dead. Professor Kelvin had sunk into a chair near the podium, his three eyes blinking in different patterns like his brain was trying to reboot. Let me understand this correctly. Humans intentionally render each other unconscious with toxic substances, then cut each other open, root around inside, and just hope the person wakes up afterward. When you say it like that, it sounds bad, Jake said. How else should I say it? I don't know, more. Medically? Look, it works. We've been doing it for over a century. The survival rates are actually pretty good. A Thraxian in the fourth row raised multiple tentacles. But how do you learn to do this? Surely you cannot practice on living beings? Jake paused. This was the moment. He could lie. He could deflect. He could suddenly remember an urgent appointment literally anywhere else. We practice on dead people, he said. The auditorium erupted. Not in applause. In what could only be described as pandemonium. Students were gesturing wildly. Translators were spitting out words in 40 different languages simultaneously, and one Vlorgian actually fell from the ceiling and had to be caught by a student with really good reflexes. Order! Professor Kelvin shouted, standing up so fast his chair fell over. Mr. Murphy, please tell me you are joking. I am not joking, Jake said. Medical students practice surgical techniques on cadavers, dead bodies, people who have donated their remains to science. It's how we learn anatomy and surgical procedures without accidentally killing someone who's, currently using their body. You desecrate the dead, a student whispered, their translator barely functioning through what sounded like genuine distress. We honor them, Jake corrected firmly. Those people chose to donate their bodies so future doctors could learn, so those doctors could save lives. It's literally one of the most generous things a human can do. Give their body to science after death so others might live. Professor Kelvin had his face in his hands. All three eyes were covered. This is worse than I thought. So much worse. I need to revise my entire thesis. What's the human pain tolerance like? Asked a brave student near the middle, apparently deciding that if the conversation was already in the pit, they might as well keep digging. Objectively terrible, Jake said. We feel pain from pretty much everything. Stubbing a toe can ruin your whole day. Kidney stones have been compared to childbirth in terms of pain intensity. And childbirth itself? Don't even get me started. Humans are basically pain sponges with anxiety. Then why do you cut each other open if you feel so much pain? Because dying hurts worse, Jake said simply. And being dead is pretty permanent. We'll take a few weeks of recovery pain over being dead forever. The logic seemed to compute, even if the aliens didn't like it. A student Jake recognized from his xenobiology class raised a claw. I have a question about one of the other instruments. The small wheel with spikes? Jake squinted at the holographic display. Oh, that's a Wartenberg wheel. That's actually not for surgery. Ah, Professor Kelvin said, perking up slightly. Finally, proof of torture devices. It's for neurological examinations, Jake said. You roll it along someone's skin to test their nerve responses. The little spikes create a sensation that helps doctors determine if there's nerve damage. It's diagnostic, not torture. It has spikes, Kelvin said weakly. So do Thraxian tentacles, and we don't call those torture devices. The Thraxian students in the room shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very aware of their spiked appendages. The human nervous system is incredibly complex, Jake continued, because apparently he had decided today was the day to traumatize an entire classroom. We've got billions of neurons firing constantly. Pain receptors, temperature receptors, pressure sensors, everything communicates through electrical and chemical signals, traveling through our bodies at varying speeds. When something goes wrong with the nervous system, these little diagnostic tools help us figure out what and where. How do you know so much about this if you dropped out of medical school? Asked a student who was probably regretting the question even as they asked it. I made it through 2 years before I quit, Jake said. Turns out watching actual surgery is very different from reading about it, especially when the patient is a Zentari and their blood smells like grape soda, and I passed out in the OR and knocked over a tray of instruments and nearly contaminated the sterile field. After that, I decided xenobiology was more my speed. Less fainting, more microscopes. Professor Kelvin looked at Jake with what might have been the first genuine emotion besides irritation that he'd shown all day. You passed out during surgery? Listen, everybody's got limits, Jake said defensively. Mine just happens to be purple blood that smells like carbonated fruit. Also, the patient was fine. The surgeon was less fine with me, but the patient recovered fully. A notification chimed through the problems. Auditorium's communication system. Professor Kelvin glanced at his datapad and his skin went from purple back to lavender, then to something approaching white. Campus security has contacted Dr. Woods, he said quietly. The human medical liaison. She's on her way. Jake felt his stomach drop. You called Patricia? I didn't call anyone. The lecture hall's AI apparently flagged this conversation as a potential diplomatic incident and auto-notified the appropriate authorities. Oh, Jake said. That's bad. Why is that bad? Asked a student. Because, Jake said, sitting down on the edge of the stage and accepting his fate. Dr. Patricia Woods does not have a sense of humor about people misrepresenting human medicine, and she definitely doesn't have a sense of humor about medical school dropouts giving unauthorized lectures. The auditorium doors opened with a hiss that sounded remarkably like the universe saying, "You're all in. Trouble now." Dr. Patricia Woods entered the auditorium with the energy of a woman who had dealt with this exact nonsense at least 4 times this semester alone. She was 53 years old, had performed over 2,000 successful surgeries before becoming the human medical liaison to the galactic academic community, and possessed the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that made hospital administrators weep and medical students stand up straighter. She took one look at Jake sitting on the stage, then at Professor Kelvin, who had the posture of a student caught cheating on an exam, then at the holographic display of surgical instruments still rotating peacefully in midair. "Let me guess," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like one of the scalpels on display. Professor Kelvin gave his annual "Humans are Violent Barbarians" lecture, and Jake decided to be helpful? "I was just correcting some misconceptions," Jake said weakly, "by giving an unauthorized medical lecture to 200 students." "When you say it like that, it sounds accurate." Dr. Woods finished. She turned to Professor Kelvin. "And you. I sent you the updated cultural sensitivity materials 3 months ago, the ones specifically about human medical practices, with pictures and footnotes. Did you read them?" Professor Kelvin's 3 eyes blinked in a pattern that Jake's translator unhelpfully rendered as, "Guilty as charged, Your Honor." "I may have skimmed them," the professor admitted. "You skimmed 20 years of medical history. In my defense, I had already completed most of my research before receiving your materials, and academic pride is a powerful—" "Save it," Dr. Woods said. She walked to the center of the stage, pulled out a holographic tablet that made Professor Kelvin's equipment look like a child's toy, and activated it with a gesture that suggested she'd done this many times before. "All right, class," she announced. "Since we're already here, and Jake has apparently blown past every diplomatic protocol we've established, let's do this properly." The holographic display shifted. Instead of static images of instruments, it now showed a live surgical theater from Earth General Hospital. A team of surgeons were performing what looked like a cardiac procedure. "This is happening right now," Dr. Woods said. "Real-time feed from Earth. That patient came in 6 hours ago with an aortic dissection. Without intervention, they'd be dead by tonight. With intervention, they've got a 92% survival rate." The auditorium watched in horrified fascination as the surgeons worked. The precision, the teamwork, the careful monitoring of every vital sign. "Notice anything?" Dr. Woods asked. "They are very calm for people cutting into another person's chest," observed Athraxian. "Exactly, because this isn't violence, this is engineering. Biological engineering with inadequate tools, but engineering nonetheless." She swiped to another display. Human surgical survival rates by procedure type. Appendectomy, 99%. Hip replacement, 95%. Coronary bypass, 97%. Brain tumor resection, 85 to 90% depending on location and type. Numbers scrolled across the display, each one representing thousands of successful procedures. "We've been doing this for thousands of years," Dr. Woods continued. "The ancient Egyptians performed skull surgery. The Romans did cataract operations. Medieval Islamic physicians pioneered surgical techniques that we still use today. We got good at this because we had to, because the alternative was watching people die from treatable conditions." She pulled up another image, this one showing a comparison chart. "Here's where it gets interesting for your research, Professor Kelvin. The Galactic Health Consortium has been studying human surgical techniques for the past decade. Want to know why?" Kelvin shook his head slowly. all three eyes fixed on the display. Because some of our primitive methods work better than your advanced technology for specific applications. She highlighted several entries. Human microsurgery techniques for nerve reattachment have a higher success rate than Zentari's cellular reconstruction for peripheral nerve damage. Our orthopedic procedures for complex fractures produce better long-term outcomes than Corthan bone regeneration in 37% of cases. And our understanding of trauma surgery, specifically how to keep someone alive when everything is going wrong simultaneously, is now required reading at the Galactic Medical Academy. The silence in the auditorium had changed. It was no longer the stunned silence of horror. It was the silence of minds being fundamentally changed. "We're not barbaric," Dr. Woods said quietly. "We're adaptive. We took the worst possible circumstances, fragile bodies, limited technology, and a universe trying to kill us, and we figured it out anyway." Every instrument in Professor Kelvin's display represents hundreds of years of humans refusing to accept death as inevitable. She turned off the display and looked directly at the professor. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to issue a formal correction to your research. You're going to attend my 6-week seminar on human medical history. And you're going to apologize to your students for teaching them that human medicine is evidence of violence rather than evidence of determination." Professor Kelvin started. Then stopped. Yes, of course, I apologize. To everyone." Dr. Woods nodded, then turned to Jake. "And you, my office, tomorrow, 9 a.m. We're going to discuss boundaries, protocol, and why medical school dropouts don't give lectures." "Yes, ma'am," Jake said, having learned long ago that arguing with Dr. Woods was like arguing with gravity, technically possible, but ultimately futile. "Good." She picked up her tablet and headed for the door, then paused. "Oh, and Jake? That explanation about anesthesia and cadavers? Surprisingly well done. If you ever want to finish your medical degree, let me know. We could use someone who can explain complex concepts to aliens without causing a diplomatic incident." "This caused a diplomatic incident," Jake pointed out. "Small one. Barely counts." She waved dismissively and left. The auditorium remained frozen for approximately 15 seconds after Dr. Woods departed, as if collectively waiting to make sure she was really gone and not about to return with additional lectures about proper academic protocol. Professor Kelvin was the first to move, straightening his robes with whatever dignity he had left. "Class dismissed," he said quietly. "We will reconvene next week for a revised lecture on human medical achievements, which I will be researching thoroughly. Very thoroughly." The students began filing out in small clusters, their conversations a mixture of amazement, confusion, and what sounded like at least 3 existential crises in progress. Jake gathered his things, namely the remnants of his sandwich, which had witnessed more drama than any sandwich deserved, and prepared to slink away into obscurity. "Mr. Murphy." Jake froze. Professor Kelvin was approaching him, and his expression was difficult to read, mostly because Jake still wasn't great at reading Zentari faces, but also because it seemed genuinely conflicted. "I owe you an apology as well," Kelvin said. "I allowed my preconceptions and academic ego to override basic research protocols. You were correct to challenge me, even if your methods were unorthodox. I probably could have raised my hand instead of yelling across the auditorium," Jake admitted. "Perhaps." Kelvin's 3 eyes focused on Jake, with something approaching respect. "But then again, I had 20 years to get this right, and didn't. You managed it in 20 minutes. That suggests the failure was mine, not yours." They stood there awkwardly for a moment, neither quite sure how to end the conversation. "For what it's worth," Jake said, "your research on other aspects of human culture was really good. The section on human festivals and food traditions was fascinating. You just picked the wrong artifacts to analyze this time." Professor Kelvin's skin shifted to a softer lavender. "Thank you. That's generous, considering I called your species barbaric for an hour." "Yeah, well, we've been called worse." They parted ways and Jake headed out of the auditorium into the campus courtyard. He made it approximately 50 feet before being intercepted by a group of students, led by his roommate Bleep, whose bioluminescent patterns were flashing, "I told you not to antagonize professors," in what Jake had learned to recognize as the Corthan equivalent of smugness. "Yes, Bleep, you were right," Jake said. "Happy?" Bleep's patterns shifted to something closer to, obviously, but also that was extremely entertaining. The human who survived their own medicine. announced a Thraxian student Jake vaguely recognized from the auditorium. That's what they're calling you on the campus network. Jake pulled out his datapad and checked. Sure enough, the lecture had already become a trending topic on the university's social feeds. Someone had even created a highlight reel of his explanations, titled, "Human explains why cutting each other open is actually fine." "Oh no," Jake said. "Oh yes," said a Vlorgen who had materialized next to him, their gelatinous form rippling with what might have been amusement. "You are campus famous now. Next you should explain more confusing human things." "I really shouldn't," Jake said, but the students were already gathering closer, their various appendages, sensors, and communication organs all focused on him with the intensity of people who had just discovered a new form of entertainment. "Is it true humans drink fermented plant matter that makes them temporarily stupid?" asked one student. "Is it true you keep carnivorous animals in your homes as companions?" asked another. "What about the thing where you inject weakened diseases into healthy people on purpose?" Jake looked at Bleep, whose patterns clearly said, "You did this to yourself." "Okay," Jake said, resigning himself to his fate. "Coffee. Let's start with coffee, because that one's relatively harmless." The group moved toward the campus cafe, an establishment that served beverages for 40 different species and had exactly one menu item labeled, "Human consume, at own risk." Jake ordered his usual coffee black, no sugar, hot enough to be legally considered a weapon on some planets, and turned to face his growing audience. "This," he said, holding up the cup, "is made from seeds. We take them from a plant, roast them until they're burnt, grind them into powder, and then force boiling water through the powder to extract the bitter compounds." "That sounds horrible," said a Pixarian. "It is horrible," Jake agreed. "It tastes like regret and poor life. Choices. We drink it anyway because it contains a chemical called caffeine that makes our brains work faster, temporarily, until it wears off and we need more." "So it's a drug," a Thraxian said slowly. "It's a stimulant, yes. We're mildly addicted to it as a species. Most human adults consume it daily. Some consume it multiple times daily. I've personally had 4 cups today, and it's only noon." The students stared at him with a mixture of horror and fascination. "But you consume it voluntarily," a Vlorgen said, their form pulsing with confusion, "knowing it is addictive." "Voluntarily, eagerly. And we'll get irritable if we don't have it." Jake confirmed. He took a long sip of his coffee, maintaining eye contact with the group to establish dominance. "Or maybe just to commit to the bit. Some humans even pay premium prices for artisanal versions made from beans that have been partially digested and excreted by small mammals." "I'm sorry, what?" several students said simultaneously, their translators apparently struggling with the concept. "Yeah, there's this thing called Kopi Luwak where you know what, that's probably enough cultural education for one day." But Bleep's patterns were flashing something that translated to, "No. Please continue. I want to watch them suffer." Jake grinned. Maybe being campus famous wouldn't be so bad after all. He had 2 more years until graduation, and apparently, he'd just discovered his true calling, explaining why human survival strategies looked absolutely insane to everyone else in the galaxy. "All right," he said, settling into a chair as the group gathered around. "Let me tell you about how humans figured out that moldy bread could cure infections. It's a story that involves a scientist who was terrible at cleaning his lab." The students leaned in, eager and horrified in equal measure. Somewhere across campus, Dr. Woods received a notification that Jake Murphy was conducting another unauthorized educational session. She read it, smiled, and marked it as acceptable diplomatic outreach. The kid had potential, even if he did have a tendency to traumatize aliens with the truth about human civilization. And in his office, Professor Kelvin sat down to begin revising 20 years of research, starting with a new title, Human Medical Innovation, Evidence of Extreme Problem-Solving in Adverse Conditions. It wasn't as catchy as primitive murder tools, but it had the distinct advantage of being accurate, which in academia was generally considered important.